Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar, Finding Efficiencies in Software Testing. Our speaker for the day is Melissa Tondi. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester, and I'm excited to host you all and Melissa on our STP trainings. Before we get started with Melissa, I want to take advantage of the fact that we all are here and share quick information with all the testers who have joined us. We have our conference, Fall 2017 STP Con, coming up in the Washington, D.C. area from September 25th through 29th this year. So as you can see on the screen, we have various certification courses through these dates. There are workshops through September 26th and 27th, and conference and sessions through September 28th, 29th. Typically, the conference topics include automation, agile, performance, DevOps, mobile security, leadership strategy, and much more. And we normally do have over 16 workshops and over 40 sessions spanning across various formats, case studies, hands-on exercises, and tool demos. So the exact program will be up there shortly. However, you can explore the previous conferences and the conference pricing and special events for the upcoming one at stpcon.com. And if you register by 26th of August, you get to save up to $400 off your registration. Honestly, I find conferring to be one of the best ways to learn and also to get to know reputed testers across the globe. I hope you all find it to be the same way. And if you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar with your followers and connections. We love the shout outs, and if you hear something that you like during the webinar, please tweet about it and use @SoftwareTestPro for a retweet from us. Another quick piece of information that I have for you is that there is an upcoming webinar, You Bet Your Life, playing the automation tool selection game. That's by Paul Grisaffi on 10th of May. The link is up for you to review and register. Paul has been a big supporter and a regular speaker at STP. He's truly an authority on practicing automation, and he loves sharing his practical insights, something you all will enjoy. So I hope you go for it. All right, let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome to you, Melissa. We're very thrilled to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Melissa Tondi has spent most of her career working within software testing teams. She's the founder of DMAC Forum, Denver Mobile and Quality, and she's also a board member of Software Quality Association of Denver, that's known as SQUAD. She's the Director of Quality Engineering at EMS Software, where she assists teams to continuously improve the pursuit of quality software, from design to delivery and everything in between. In her software test and quality engineering careers, Melissa has focused on building and organizing teams around three major tenets: efficiency, innovation, and culture, and has created the greatest common denominator, the GCD approach, for determining in which team members can assess, implement, and report on day-to-day activities, so the gap between need and value is as small as possible. Right before we start, a few housekeeping points for you. All the attendees shall remain muted through the webinar. You can type in your questions and share them with us through your question or chat box, whichever appears on your version of GoToWebinar. We shall take them up after Melissa is done with her presentation. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the Software Test Pro site for the attendees to go through later. So, all right, Melissa, very warm welcome again, and the floor is all yours now.
Thank you very much, and let me say a special thanks to Smita for helping moderate this webinar, and to the whole STP team for hosting this webinar. I'm very excited to be presenting this in this webinar format. And a couple of things from me. If you've ever heard me speak before, my sessions tend to be very collaborative, and so I rely just as much on audience participation and questions as possible. So you have kind of three natural breaks within this content here. So as I go through some slides, if there are questions that you have, I will ask for questions after those kind of 3 natural breaks rather than waiting until the very end of the webinar. So keep those questions coming, and I'll ask for Smita to read those off to me when we get to those natural breaks within the content. So again, thanks, and hope you enjoy the next 55 minutes or so talking about finding efficiencies in software testing. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, talk a little bit about what we're going to present here and what we're going to essentially talk about. So I have this on here, why me? It's really essentially my background, and Smita did a great job of kind of talking about that. Although I'm the one presenting in this webinar, really want to focus on topics and areas that you'll get the most out of during the next hour or so. And then we kind of deep dive into just talking about setting the stage of why is there never enough time? That has been a continual and consistent message when I talk with various testers, whether individuals or teams or large departments, and never enough time always seems to resonate across the masses. So we'll talk a little bit about why we can start looking at not only efficiencies in our overall flow and approach to our work days and cycles, but also micro efficiencies, really kind of finding those activities that we may
Melissa, sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
That's
I
okay.
guess we're not able to see your screen right now. If you could just share it.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I thought I did share that, but let me apologize. Is that better?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the micro efficiencies on activities that we tend to emphasize within our testing cycle, and then really focus on areas that may be redundant within those testing activities, and hopefully with the goal of either decreasing the time that we spend on those activities, or in some cases eliminating from those. And so we'll really kind of deep dive into those areas that either myself and teams that I've worked with have found, and then really kind of, as always, content that I usually tend to present are based off of real-world situations that span across not only my experience and history, but also people just like you. So again, I encourage you to ask those questions and share your experiences as we walk through these slides. And then most importantly, is once we identify those inefficiencies, how will we fix them? What are some ways that we can address those so that we can, again, either significantly reduce the time that we're spending there, or in some cases eliminate those? And then if we have time, we'll talk about areas that I and others have successfully put in place once we see the time savings and fixing those inefficiencies. So we'll talk about areas that you or others may have not had the time to talk about or think about or actually build into your testing approach. And again, I have open Q&A here, but hopefully we'll kind of have those collaborative questions throughout the session. So let's get started here. So let's talk a little bit about me. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on myself here, but for the past 20 plus years, I have spent a significant amount of time in the QA, QE, software testing, and Agile spaces, and especially the last 10 or so years in the Agile spaces. So I tend to focus on quality engineering, and most of my career for the last 7 years or so has been spent working with kind of transitioning traditional QA or testing teams into quality engineers. And so you'll see me emphasize a bit on that. But again, we kind of talk, and as Smita mentioned in my bio, really my career has been focused on those 3 tenets of efficiency, innovation, and culture. All right, so let's, again, why is there never enough time? And these, again, are some areas that I've seen consistently, either in teams that I've been on or others that have shared their experiences. So we have decreased schedules. Whether you are practicing waterfall or agile or some other flavor of an SDLC approach, we tend to see decreased schedules from testing, and that comes from a variety of reasons, whether estimates were not accurate enough, and so as things tend to flow downhill to the testing team, if dev estimates or design or architecture estimates to the left of us somehow were inaccurate and those original estimates increased, and without a date shift or without a release date shift, we tend to see that the time that we had originally wanted to schedule for testing tends to be decreased by that. We also see reasons why we tend to have our time shortened, or we feel that we don't have enough time because sometimes decisions are made in a silo. Sometimes QE or QA does not have an equal seat at the table when we start looking at planning and releasing and refinement and some of those Scrum or Agile ceremonies. So if we tend to get our work after all of the work has been planned, and we're not really having, we're not considered a first-class citizen within those types of meetings. When those decisions are made in a silo, we tend to have to play catch up, and sometimes we inject more work simply by asking the right questions, that if we had that appropriate seat at the table earlier on, we would have actually had some time spent. So if we don't have that appropriate seat at the table when all of those meetings kick off, those decisions tend to be made in a silo, and the testing activities aren't accounted for appropriately. A lot of times we see that risks are not vetted out appropriately or with enough emphasis. So I like to emphasize kind of a three-tiered approach on refining the work that's actually coming through to the team, not just QE or QA, but for the whole team. And then again, as I mentioned, really kind of emphasizing that appropriate seat at the table there. And of course, you may have many other reasons why you as an individual or as a team feel that there's never enough time. But these are, again, kind of some of the areas that we've emphasized. So taking these 4 areas into consideration is really kind of what drove the content of this session. So let's move into what kind of testing activities do we emphasize. And none of these should really be as a surprise if you have been practicing as a tester or QA or QE for even just the last 3 months or more. Some of these may sound and should sound very, very familiar to you. So of course we talk about test planning and test management, and before we actually testing, what types of activities are we doing to prep for the actual test execution? And we tend to call those either test planning or test management, and most of us probably use some sort of a test management tool to store all of our tests, whether they're automated or not. And so one of the questions that we'll kind of go into is thinking about what's the ratio that you spend on the planning and management of your testing versus the actual execution. And I'll talk a little bit about a ratio that I have found successful, and hopefully you will as well, or some flavor of that. We also emphasize planning the stories by simply vetting out the requirements or acceptance criteria that is listed either within the documents that we are looking at or within the acceptance criteria. But if you're like me, you may have experienced either incomplete or inaccurate acceptance criteria. That seems to be a theme that tends to follow a lot of Agile teams. Or incomplete or inaccurate or ever-changing requirements. So if we're simply emphasizing our testing activities and planning based off of those 2 types of activities, we are missing a whole slew of areas that we can start really vetting out the appropriate and comprehensive testing solutions in there. We again so once we start receiving stories or work for us to test, one of the very first things that we do is we start executing the test cases against the acceptance criteria or the requirements. And not that that's a bad thing, but that's one of the areas that I want to emphasize on ways that we tend to see a lot of inefficiencies in there. So we'll emphasize where we can find simply by this exercise of the first thing that we do when we receive a story or features or functions to test is not necessarily executing the test against that story. There are some ways that we can vet out and find deeper rooted bugs first versus just simply executing those tests. And then, of course, we emphasize the finding and writing up of bugs, which some would argue is one of the most important functions and activities that testers can do. And then once we're done, we report in some capacity what our testing activities were, whether we are reporting on bugs found in a weekly or biweekly session, or whether we are reporting on number of test cases that have been executed and failed versus passed rate or on hold rate. So these are some activities that we tend to emphasize when we're going through testing. And again, none of these should be should be foreign to any of you, but these are areas, just because from a compartmentalization piece, really want to focus on these specific activities as we move through the content. So let's move into where do we find the inefficiencies. So let's go back into our first activity of test planning and test management. Many of us tend, and I will be the first one to admit here, when I first started out my career 20 plus years ago, I prided myself on the very detailed length and breadth of the test cases that I was writing. I was known for essentially using that term, anyone off of the street can execute my test cases. And I think my intent was good, but what wound up happening is while I was spending all of this time making sure that the test cases were almost perfect and extremely detailed, I could have been spending some of that time, if not a lot of that time, actually testing. And as you know, the best way for testers to really be providing and adding value to the team is when we're actually testing and doing some of those activities to prep us through. So we find some inefficiencies in very, very detailed test cases. And again, we'll kind of, when we go into the fixing portion of this webinar, we'll talk a little bit about things that we should consider when we want to know how much is enough. How much detail is enough? Do we truly need to be writing those test cases so that anyone off of the street can execute them? Or is there some way that as a team we can come up with some consistent details and levels to which we're writing those test cases? And then we find inefficiencies with formal test case reviews with, teammates outside of the QE or QA team. I still see lots of meetings on people's calendars where it's a detailed meeting and presentation of the test cases where everybody on the team is taking half an hour to 2 hours or so out of their time to spend just simply reviewing these test cases. Not that test case reviews are a bad thing, but when we tend to put heavy or formal meetings around those, we see a lot of inefficiencies in there. And so again, we'll kind of talk a little bit about that as finding an inefficient piece and then addressing those. And then sometimes we tend, and unless we're in a regulated environment where test plans are actually required for us, we tend to put a lot of effort into a test plan document. And I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing here, test planning is different than a test plan document. So I'm 100% in agreement with planning and strategizing how we're going to work and how we're eventually going to test. But I would question the value of a test plan without asking why and simply understanding what value does that actual separate test plan document provide to not only us as QEs, but to the team. So one of the other areas that we find inefficiencies is when we duplicate test efforts. So, and we could go all the way down if you're in a team of 2 or more QEs or testers. I would assume that you are constantly collaborating with your counterparts in there. So we're not really talking about the duplication of testing efforts within the QE team on a project. We're really talking about those duplicated test efforts across the team. So I use this term, give credit where credit is due, but we really should know our devs. And if we don't have that collaborative relationship with our dev teams, we don't really know what level each individual or the dev team as a whole is testing their own work before they actually say it's ready for us to begin testing. We've actually found, especially in the last 2 companies that I've been in and consulted with, we've found that individual devs really were spending a lot of time testing their own code and all the integrations outside of their unit and automated integration tests. And so what we found was that the very first half an hour to 45 minutes that the QE team was spending testing stories or features or functions that were coming our way were tests that were already executed with the devs. So actually having that conversation with them and figuring out what they're doing may allow us to complement their testing versus duplicating that. And again, when we start looking at inefficiencies, and in this case micro inefficiencies, that 30 to 45 minutes that were spent testing something that the devs were already testing on their own could have been time that we spent on other areas that we might not have had time to spend before. And then really, you know, if any good product owner, UX designer, or a stakeholder should be and would be testing right alongside of you, whether it's testing while the devs are continuing to code or while we're continuing to test. Simply asking that question of what they're testing, again, allows us to not eliminate that testing necessarily from our portfolio of what we are planning on doing during that cycle, but it's really de-emphasizing that at the beginning if several other eyes outside of the QE team are doing some of that testing as well. So we also find inefficiencies with being an enabler, or what I call the martyr, with scheduler scope creep. You know, we tend to be, and I have been in this situation, as I'm sure many of you have as well, where it could be late on a Thursday or Friday or maybe Saturday or Sunday, and if we're in the office, we look around and we see that it's the testing team only that's spending that time, because what winds up happening is in those situations where dev or UX or architectural estimates may be off, we don't tend to use the stand-ups and those appropriate stand-up meetings with the team to really talk a little bit about when something slips to the left of us, is the expectation that the QE team should be that end-all be-all bucket of making up the entire schedule of the sprint within those last couple or 3 days. So we tend to enable what I call maybe some impactful and certainly bad or at least non-desirable behaviors in that situation. So I talk a little bit about some conversations that we can have at the team level to help us bring to light and be transparent of when something to the left of us isn't and does not happen the way that we had originally planned, making sure that those conversations are happening and centralized so that we're not, as in QE is not responsible for fixing that, but the team as a whole is responsible for helping us come up with a solution that is accepted by all. And again, you know, we talk a little bit about these Agile Scrum methods, and for those of you who are practicing Agile, some flavor of Agile, whether it's Scrum or something else, we really need to continue to emphasize that all the team members' work needs to be accounted for. So if we get to the point where we're using rough ratios of whatever the dev's time is, we just have it, and that's all the QE time has. Or if we are assuming that across a 10-day sprint that we're not taking into account a 10-day sprint may be either a 6 to an 8 hour workday. So if a 6-hour workday in a 10-day sprint, you have 60 hours of work. What I've found is that we tend to not necessarily emphasize the fact that that 60 hours should be spent and evenly spread across all 10 days. What tends to happen is, and what I've heard from countless people, is that we wind up getting work from dev the last 2 days of the sprint, and all of a sudden those 60 hours or points that we assumed would be happening throughout the sprint are all compressed into the last final 2 days or 3 days of the sprint. And then what winds up happening is we either, from a testing team, need to make up a lot of that time and work those extra hours those last couple of days of the sprint, or all of that work gets rolled over. And every time we roll over testing work from sprint to sprint, we continue to create a gap and really in some cases a chasm between dev and QE that will be really hard for us to make up that work when we have multiple sprints. And so by the time we get to the point where we're ready to release, we may have had and accrued many sprints worth of QA work simply because we are not taking into consideration that blended and evenly distributed hours per day across the sprint. So another way that we find inefficiencies is multiple testing environments. And again, there may be a very good reason why we have multiple testing environments. I've heard anywhere from one test environment, and then from that QA or test environment we move into production, or I've heard as many as 6 or 7 environments, and I'm talking serially going through there. So a typical deployment path would be from an integration environment to QA, and from QA to possibly another hardening or staging environment, and from there moving into a separate performance environment, and from there moving into production. So not that multiple environments is necessarily a bad thing, but more so the question should be how many is too many, and you'll have to judge that from your own, and what is the purpose of those environments, and is there a way for us to combine environments, or at least if we wind up needing to test on multiple environments until we eventually get into production, are we being scrutinizing on where the gaps are in between, or the differences between those lower environments to those upper environments, so that we can ensure that if and when we determine that we do need to test in multiple environments, that we're running and executing the right tests versus all of the tests because we don't know that information. Okay, so some of the other inefficiencies that we found in here is that we have QE-only sprints or cycles. And, you know, and really I've seen this, and I would love for any of you to share your experience on QE-only sprints or cycles and whether or not you see value in them. I've tended to see that QE-only sprints have tended to come about because we are again delivering code those last couple of days of the sprints versus throughout and consistently throughout those sprints. And so again, as we went back to my previous example of kind of creating those gaps, if we consistently roll over QE only types of stories where the dev work was done, but the testing was not complete. By the end of those cycles, if we are especially more than one sprint behind, we will then have a need for the QE-only sprints, which means that unless dev is actively testing with us during that time, dev is likely starting on some other next work. And really what we're doing is we are just continuing a bad practice of not considering a story or work complete until all of the testing is complete. So we talk a little bit about how we can address that as well. And then we have a QE hardening again, and it's really sort of the same thing where towards the end of a cycle, we may have a sprint or two where it's just QE hardening. And again, that concept is not necessarily a bad practice, but we tend to use that QE hardening sprint as something that is essentially a catch-all bucket of things that we weren't doing as efficiently all the way to the left of where we're getting to that piece, right? So we talk a little about, I say that any time of where there's more than 2 days within a sprint where QE and dev are not working tightly coupled together will tend to be a flag for us. And we'll work that through some of our Scrum ceremonies like stand-ups or refinements in there. So again, we're talking a little bit about where do we tend to find inefficiencies. We're not taking advantage of agile ceremonies, and I know that this term is a little bit unorthodox. I know that this really kind of Scrum ceremonies, but I tend to use agile ceremonies because there are, you know, we all know the usual suspects. So we have release planning, we have stand-ups, we have retros, and then I'm sure you guys have others that you do. I tend to think that we, especially in the stand-ups arena, we tend to simply want to get out of that meeting because they don't provide as much value as we would like them to do. So instead of course correcting and using these meetings to provide value, we tend to follow scripts, and when we follow scripts and they no longer are valuable to most or all of the members of the team, we tend to want to rush through those. So instead of trying to rush through these meetings that tend to be rote and rhetorical, we really want to make sure that we're taking advantage of those types of Agile or Scrum ceremonies. All right, so I'm going to pause there. And Smita, has any questions, and talk a little bit about kind of the areas either from time, where do we tend to lose time, and some of the efficiencies that I presented. Any questions that have come my way?
So Melissa, we do have a couple of comments and questions here. We have a particularly enthusiastic and engaging tester with us today, Tony. So I'll just read out his comments and then read out his two questions. So first of all, he says, you're describing my work world. So accepted, Tony. We are all in the same boat. So yes, makes sense. And he says, test planning should include requirement analysis that saves inefficiencies later when testers don't understand the vague requirements. His another comment is, in a global test effort, you also need to know your test leads. Each site will be responsible for separate dev efforts. So in the integration, there are efficiencies in dividing the testing effort using these lines. His final comment is, using a continuous integration approach could relieve the pressure at the end of sprint. And his questions are, why not insert system testers in the requirements definition stage? That's one. And the other one is, how do you get dev to support system testing when they really don't like to test beyond unit testing? If at any point you want me to repeat them, please let me know, Melissa.
Okay, so I'll say, yep, all the comments are exactly essentially why I'm presenting this content. I mean, I tend to, as other speakers like me, we tend to speak on what we know and what resounds with the community. And so I'm glad that, I think I'm glad that this explains your world, Tony, but I'm hoping that after we talk a little bit here, that we'll at least be able to bring some ways back that you can bring specifically back to your teams to help us with that. So I'm all for systems testers being part of the requirements analysis, whether that's in an agile or a non-agile team format. In my opinion, I think I'm a big proponent of anyone that has responsibility for doing some or all of the work on either stories or all of the activities within a cycle, a dev and an SDLC cycle essentially, should be part of those plannings or at least have representation at the lead level for those. So I totally agree with that. In my world, I've tended to work with lean companies, lean and startup companies, or companies that are small so that we don't have separate system or integration testing teams, which is why I'm a big proponent of the quality engineer, because quality engineers tend to have skill sets across those different disciplines and practices, but I'm all for that. As far as how do we kind of maybe guide dev into, into doing a little bit more testing. I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about fixing them, and some ways that I've seen success with, specifically in my in the company that I'm with right now, EMS Software, that has worked wonders, honestly. And I'll even share a win for us that happened just this morning. So I'll address that in the next upcoming slides. Any other questions, Smita?
You have a couple of them more, so you want me to take a break?
Okay. Yeah, let's give another 1 or 2 minutes to those, and then I'll move back into.
All right. So here is Nicole, who says, what are your steps to showing how important testing is? We have an environment where testing is seen as a roadblock, but we are the ones that can prevent major software issues from hitting the field.
So in my opinion, I will be very honest, I tried to not work with companies that don't see the value in testing, because if you haven't gathered, I'm a disruptor with the industry, and so I tend to work with companies that not only see the value but want to increase the value of testing. However, I do know that there are many people that are in companies where the value of testing is not seen. So what I tend to do is I tend to align activities that the testing team does that resonate across either the company or the organization. Some ways that we can do that is by identifying bugs before they're hopefully released in production that could ultimately affect revenue or customer loss, something around those lines. So you may, if you find yourself in the situation where you need to continue to prove the value of testing. Sometimes we do that by an increase in bug counts and then tying those to specific customers or, again, kind of revenue drivers or objectives that are important to the company.
There's another one, Melissa, which is from Elias. Elias says, I'm in a very waterfall environment. What are one or two of the most value-giving agile practices that we could implement without too much change?
I would say a refinement of work. So as dev starts work on a particular area, depending on how they organize their work, it could be by working on a feature or a function within that feature. I would encourage some of those collaborative conversations. So maybe by, maybe implementing something where if before dev starts work on the next component or module, that the tester comes in and they refine that work slightly more than what had been done before that. And I know kind of the concept of refining work in a waterfall approach is a little foreign, but it's really kind of making sure that we can start laying the tracks for an eventual TDD, test-driven development approach, which means that the tester is asking questions and talking about how they would test it so that dev can listen to that and start writing their code with that in mind. So that'd be one area that I'd say that's probably the most valuable that I've seen for companies or teams that have not quite transitioned to some sort of Agile.
All right. I'll just take one more, Melissa, and then we can get back to the presentation. Michael Frank is asking this, and this one resonates with me because I have the same problem. He says, I'm interested in how not to write detailed test cases, which I tend to do. So, yeah, that's something.
Yeah, and and like I said, this one hits me personally as well, because like I said, a lot of my career was built on my beautiful test cases that's very, very detailed, and I almost called them novels at one point. So yes, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've done with teams to kind of level set, and that all goes back to the greatest common denominator, or GCD approach that Smita mentioned in my bio before. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and I can share some of my experience of how we've gotten from detailed, very detailed test cases to bring those up to a level. All right, so let's move into our next kind of component here, which is how do we fix them, right? So now we've identified areas that we tend, or that I've seen inefficiencies come in. So now we talk about how do we fix them. So when we go back to the first one, which is test planning, I use the rule of thumb of ABT, or always be testing, and that's really, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek in there, but if you see the next bullet point in here, I like a ratio, and I say this is the only ratio that I like, because if you've ever talked to me or read anything that I've written, I tend to shy away from, and in some ways I'm very vocal about staffing a testing team simply based off of the number of devs that are associated with that team. So sometimes we tend to do a 2-to-1 dev QE ratio, or 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, whatever the ratio is. And if you haven't gathered this so far, I'm not a big proponent of that. I do believe that testing is as valuable as any other project or team member on the team and the discipline within a company. And so we tend to use that ratio, but the only ratio that I really like is the 10-80-10 ratio. And what that means is that if we look across, and we'll use just the simple example of a sprint. So if we have a 10-day sprint, and in most companies that I've worked with, we consider a working day or a capacity for a day that a team or an individual can spend on a project at around 6 hours per day. So that leaves about 2 hours or so a day for admin and non-project related work. So if we look at that and we just multiply that by 10, there's about 60 hours worth of work in a sprint. And whether you do capacity planning formally or not, or whether you estimate in hours or if you point your work, this kind of, you still have a set amount of hours within a sprint that you work with. And I like to really be accurate with that. So I tend to get to the point where a 10% test planning and management, actually writing of the tests. 80% of the time should be actually testing. And when I say testing, it's a combination of executing tests via a test management tool. Some people may call that manual testing. I'm not a fan of that term. And then also a fan of executing those tests either a tool or via a tool or by a human, but then also from an unscripted manner, which would be more exploratory and ad hoc testing. So 80% of the time really should be spent during theirs, because we know that the more we're testing, the more we can be user advocates and flesh out those bugs, before our users had that, and to ensure a delightful user experience. And then the 10 on the end here is on just the kind of the test reporting. Bug triage is anything time that we have to report on work that we've already done, or report on data that has come out of the work that we've done. So again, this is somewhat of a lofty goal, because some of you may look at that 10% on the left and say, well, there's no way I can only spend 10 hours writing tests. And so we'll kind of we'll meld that into our next topic when we talk about how much is too much when we write detailed test cases. And then, really kind of don't overthink it. I mean, this is a stretch goal for us currently in our organization, or a previous company that I was with. We were sitting at around 50%, 40%, and 10%. And so we got that 50% of test management and test planning, actually writing the tests, down to about 20%. So that was a significant decrease in what was really considered overhead of writing the tests. We still got what we needed, but we were able to increase actual testing during that time. Okay, so that's how we talk about test planning. So that's one area that you may and your team strive to do. And again, the 10-80-10 is a stretch goal. I've certainly seen this, and I've implemented this in organizations. It takes a little while because there are activities that we need to put in place before we get to that 10-80-10. But a 10-80-10 really ensures that we are focusing our efforts on the best areas, which is the actual testing. And we really, when we get to the testing point, the assumption is that we've done the appropriate amount of testing using risk-based and context-driven techniques to really make sure that we're focusing on there, and then really kind of split the time where that testing is not simply running through test cases, nor is it simply running through an automated test scripts, because as you know, test automation is not testing, it's simply checking. We really want that 80% and that exploratory testing to be spent with the human tester really interacting with the product, those features and functions, and ultimately becoming more or emphasizing the user advocacy. So now we move into duplicating testing efforts, and I alluded to this earlier. So, simply by having the conversation about what do individual devs do as part of their own checks and balances when they say something is done from their side and ready to be tested. So I've kind of used the concept of the definition of done, which is a very agile term to talk about kind of what does done mean from an agile standpoint, from either at the story level or from a release standpoint. And that's all very well defined. I've really, because that term was such a well-known term, we've really brought that back into the disciplines that make up our project teams here. So we use the definition of done to not only determine from a product standpoint what does done mean when we are ready to deliver and ship something, but we then talked about what does the definition of done mean to dev. So we wound up using, by a series of kind of kickoff meetings and what I would just call a map, or it's really, it looks like a PowerPoint presentation really. And this talks about all of the things that each discipline does when they say their piece is done. So when we talked about the earlier question of how do we ensure that dev, even though they might not like to test, that they do test. So one thing that we've done is this acceptance criteria piece, which is at the kickoff, we knew that that a lot of our time, QE's time, was spent actually simply walking through the acceptance criteria once dev handed over that code to us, right? And so it's a very meaningful test, but maybe it wasn't something that was solely the responsibility of the QE to do, because what we were finding was more and more individual devs had already been doing that as part of their own definition of done. So what we did is we took the concept of definition of done, and we had each discipline, so our Scrum Master, our product owner, our development team, and our Q team, do an exercise of the things that they do, and not only what they do, but that they agree to do before they move something into the next column. So from an Agile standpoint, if you're using something like TFS or Jira, things tend to move to the right when they're done, and they move in, and the next activity is expected to be done. So we really talked about each discipline having their definition of done, so that when dev did eventually hand something off and said, this is ready to be tested, that the agreement was that they themselves would demo the acceptance criteria either as part of their code or peer review or as part of their own checks. And that really saved us a ton of time, because what we would have tended to do without having that agreement is that QE would go in there and walk through those steps and spend 30 minutes to 2 hours of actually going through acceptance criteria when dev had already done that. So we brought that into the definition of done. It became an agreement, so that the assumption is now that because dev agreed to do that in a public setting such as a kickoff, and they said this is what we will do as part of our definition of done, QE did not need to emphasize those activities, and that broadened our and made our testing time way more efficient. We were able to find early bugs earlier on than we had ever before, because we weren't spending the first 30 minutes to 60 minutes going through the simple checklist of AC. So that's one area that we can look at when we talk about duplicating testing efforts. So how do we fix being the martyr, right? This is sometimes maybe it's a personality thing for all of us. Again, for those of you who've been in the career for as long as I have or longer, or even less sometimes, we tend to be that martyr. And that's a great trait from us, because we want to make sure that the project in and of itself is successful. But in some cases, if we continue to be the martyr and not speak up in those appropriate forums, we will tend to be that martyr and then become an enabler for those bad practices. So we should really focus on areas. Again, I kind of alluded to the risk-based and context-driven approaches. If you're not familiar with those terms, you should be. What we're saying is, we should all have the same information. And if somebody has more information than another person who has responsibility on that story or within the project, we need to make sure that that information is centralized and everybody has access to that information. So that eliminates kind of those one-off conversations where maybe a developer and a product manager are talking about something that inevitably changes the acceptance criteria, but no one actually brings in the rest of the team. So by the time that story comes our way from a testing standpoint, we may be testing it based off of the original acceptance criteria that was agreed to, and yet that acceptance criteria has changed. So we really want to make sure that we emphasize context-driven approaches so that we're all working off of the same information. We also should be emphasizing being a musketeer, all for one and one for all. As a team, an Agile emphasizes this beautifully. If the team is successful, if all are successful, and the team should not be considered successful if one area or discipline is not successful, which means that we should really be collaborative in swarming areas when we see unhealthy practices like estimates not being adhered to, or not having a plan for if schedules increase, how do we account for that work and still make sure that we can deliver everything in a shippable manner at the end of that sprint. A lot of times what we tend to not do is, if something is added to our plate, we don't have that next step conversation to say, okay, well, so since this is being added to my plate now, what is our plan as a team to take on this work? Are we all expected to work longer hours to take in this work? Are we all willing to remove one or more stories to take on this work, or something like that? We tend to just say, oh, somebody added it to our list, now we have to do it, and without having that deeper conversation during those stand-up times. And then, I advocate an 8-10 sprint. And so for those of you who have a 10-day sprint, I kind of give a little detail on what this is. So we tend to spend the first 2 days with dev coding and QE writing the tests that are in conjunction with all of the work that is expected to be done, and just kind of doing our last sets of planning and strategizing. The next 6 days, so day 3 through 8, we expect that stories will start flowing our way very consistently across the days. And then going back to that, the example where I said, we have 60 hours per sprint, we don't expect for the QE team, or shouldn't expect for the QE team, to work all 60 of those hours for testing in the last 2 days of the sprint. So having an 8-10 sprint where we are really we're really basing the estimates or the pointing off of really truly 8 days of forward dev work. And then those last 2 days of the sprint, we call dev complete, the last day of that 8th day, or the end of the day of that last day, so that the last 2 days are spent cleaning up and completing our testing for those residual stories that have come in on day 8, and then doing any kind of bug fixes and testing of those bug fixes. And that really ensures that we don't get into the situation where dev is giving us a ton of deliverables that last day of the sprint, and now we can't actually complete the sprint from a full definition of done because we're still busy testing those last stories. And then multiple environments, and I kind of have this as an open discussion. I'll say this because I don't really have a great answer. I will say, ask the question, why do we have multiple environments, and to whom do they add value? And that should hopefully lead to, at least having a better understanding of why those multiple environments are in place, and more importantly, what's the appropriate amount of testing that needs to be done on those, and not just simply executing all of the test cases on those environments. And I'm a big fan of using that test automation in these multiple environments, and kind of fine-tuning those automated test scripts to make sure that they run on all the environments that we support from a testing team, but they eliminate the need for the human testers to really be focusing on these multiple environments. All right, so we talk a little bit about QE only, or sprints or cycles, and again, I like to, the ABC rule, always be coupled. I use that example of really a flag for me is if there are 2 days that have gone by, and we can kind of use this as an example on sprint day 3, we expect that the first stories from dev have come our way, that they're ready to be tested on sprint day 3. And if they're not, we immediately discuss that in stand-up. And the next questions are, when will these be ready? And will they impact our schedule for being able to complete what we committed to at planning? And if so, what will the team decide to either remove, or what will the team decide to do in order to make up that time? And really having that deliberate conversation within the stand-up. So that's why sprint days 3 through 8 are critical for us, because again, we consider those where most of the bulk of the work is being done. And again, if there are more than 2 days that have elapsed where we are not able to support testing or the dev activities by testing with dev, that is considered a flag for us, and we work it through those normal channels. Again, use that definition of done example that I talked about. If you don't currently have a definition of done or some sort of an agreement that is based off of all of the disciplines that represent your project team, you may want to take that example and make sure that the definition of done is agreed that a story is not only dev'd but completely tested and eventually shippable at the end of the sprint. So simply by retuning what the end of the sprint means and saying it needs to be shipped, which means that it should be able to be consumed by our users, that has worked miracles, honestly, with just the deliverables at the end of the sprint. And we've seen a significant decrease of rollover work that tended to happen without having those deliberate and thoughtful conversations. So then I kind of talk a little about the Agile ceremonies, and I've talked a little bit about here about these as well. So demos. Again, we like to have these demos. We tend to have these demos at the end of the sprint, but as you probably have seen, when we wait until the end of the sprint to demo work, and if there's been no other checkpoint before that, we may wind up having to go back to the drawing board because either an AC was misunderstood or missed or not complete, or product goes in there and says, that's not what I was expecting. So try and shift those demos to the left of the end of the feature or the end of the sprint as much as possible. We encourage demoing again to the team before that code is checked in, and simply by walking through the acceptance criteria, and dev in our organizations have agreed that that's part of their definition of done, where they will demo that acceptance criteria that it's been met before it's actually even ready for QA, because at that point we know that we are saving a ton of time with that, and we're resetting expectations. And if we need to make a change in that acceptance criteria, it's way easier to do it at the time that that story is demoed and before it gets to test than to waiting for the 2 weeks after, or even more if you're not doing subsequent demos at the end of the sprint. I'm a big fan of the refinements and groomings, and this will go back to one of the questions here. I say the meat and potatoes. We tend to think that refinements and grooming sessions have to be these huge formal meetings with everybody on the team. We've replaced that with working sessions. And so I say meet in quotes because it really is, we're meeting but not necessarily formally. We're collaborating versus meeting and setting up a time in there, because as everyone is sensitive to having many meetings on their calendar, we want to be sensitive to that, but we want to make sure that when we're refining and grooming work before the work starts and before that work gets tested, that we're having those checkpoints and collaboratively talking about different scenarios that we have thought about after the initial, say feature refinement or planning in there. So it's kind of this stepped and tiered refinement that we like to have, so that by the time that work is starting, that the team that's responsible for doing all the work associated to that story knows exactly what's being done, and each of their voices has been heard. So instead of having these huge, hour, 2, 3 hour long grooming and refinement sessions with the entire team, where if you're not actively working on a story, you're probably doing something else and not engaged, we've replaced that with smaller working sessions to where everybody's at the table and everybody's speaking and having a collaborative conversation. All right, so I'm going to leave it here because I know we've got about 5 minutes left here. So I wanted to, this is kind of one of those areas. So now what we've done is, we've talked about what are the things, where are we inefficient? And again, I'm listing some of the areas that we talked about here, and obviously there are many others. These are the ones that really kind of resonated and have been consistent from people I've talked with over the years. And then how do we fix them? The assumption is that because maybe you can hit all 6 of these areas, or maybe 1 or 2 of those, and take these back to your company today or tomorrow, what would you do with the time that you've saved in there? And I advocate, if you're not already actively doing accessibility testing, this is something that can broaden your own portfolio. Same thing with performance testing, and I'm not talking about performance engineering, I'm talking about specific performance tests that the testers can be doing versus waiting until what we tend to do is at the end of a cycle or at the end of a release that we throw all of this and have heavy load in there, and that's the only performance testing that's considered. And then security, and I kind of listed some references here that you may be able to start increasing your own testing activities and services based on the time that we would hopefully have saved with identifying those inefficiencies and then fixing them. So with that said, I'll leave that for some other questions.
Yeah, we do have tons of them coming in, so good for you. All right. So first is, I'll take this from Rachel. She says, any tips for breaking the cycle if QA is already lagging behind dev, testing work built up from earlier sprints? Now, Michael, who had earlier asked the question, he has asked a question on a similar line earlier that was saying that, okay, in my life, it has always been dev that slows down the release process because a bug is being fixed and it is taking away too long. Then it falls back into the QA hands, and then we get blamed for pushing the schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that tends to be it. I really, really, really like the having each team present what they're doing so that it becomes public record. If you say something publicly in the form of a kickoff or stand-up that I'm going to do something, it's the only, if you don't do it, it really, the only one to not blame necessarily, because I don't want to have that as a culture, but really you're responsible for doing what you said you were going to do. And you're also responsible for bringing it up when you can't do what you originally said you're going to do. And I tend to emphasize that in stand-ups. So in the situations where dev estimates have either increased significantly where it's going to shorten the QE time, I would pose the question and simply saying, I see that the dev work has taken longer than planned. What should we as a team do to make up that time? And let that question sit with the team. It's not our responsibility to necessarily say, well, I guess it's testing, I guess we have to work longer hours now because dev didn't do that. I would just let and see, and really most teams will want to make up for that work. We tend to just assume that it's our job to do it without pushing it back to the team. And it goes back to that Three Musketeer example of all for one and one for all. Inevitably, schedules will change. Injection work will happen, a bug will take longer to fix than not. It's that person's responsibility and then the team's responsibility to figure out how can we swarm and collaborate and help that, and not necessarily assume that it's just the testing team that needs to do that. Another way is to, so if there's something that can't be pulled out of the sprint, I may suggest, I like to use a priority 1 through 3 key in all of our tests, which means that, so if it gets to the point where we don't have enough time to execute all of the tests or complete all the testing that we plan to do, we should be able to easily pull out those highest priority tests and say, okay, we as a team will accept the risk that not all tests that were originally planned will be executed, and therefore the testing team will only execute priority 1s and priority 2s, or priority 1s and half of priority 2s. And that way we're pushing it back to the team to say, we as a team, for whatever reason, could not meet what we committed to. Now we as a team are responsible for fixing it, not just the testing team. That is a cultural shift as well, but sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease, if you've ever heard that, that saying. And in this way, we really need to be focusing on the team agreements and having the team chip in on that.
So, Melissa, we are running short on time, but I'm going to pick a couple of them and then we'll be done. So
Okay.
one of them is from Joe. He says, do you find value in a cross-functional development team where developers can test if needed and testers can develop when needed as well?
Absolutely. The quality engineer role that I have in the quality engineering kind of departments or teams that I've built have technical skill sets in addition to kind of that cross-functional team. So going back to one of the original questions is what happens when something has happened in the schedule where test time has not been we don't have enough time to complete our testing without working exorbitant hours. I have absolutely, recommended that the dev team take a chunk of testing and split their time between scripted testing and unscripted testing within those areas directed by the QE lead or the QE team to make up for some of that time. And honestly, we found a lot of bugs during those sessions than maybe we would have found if it was just the QE team responsible for that testing. I'm a big proponent of, if at the end of that sprint that we don't have enough time to test, I'm a big proponent of having the team swarm under the direction of QE. So with a little bit of organization and responsibilities kind of split up, I'm absolutely a fan of both of those.
Louis says, great presentation. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Years ago, back in the waterfall world, I learned that the general ratio of design, coding, testing in a software project was 40-20-40. Specifically, 40% proportion of a software project involves all testing tasks, including test planning, design, execution. How has the percentage of design, coding, testing changed with agile projects, if there is anything specific?
Oh, so I think first of all, we tend to not even think about that because I think the way that we plan and point our work has fundamentally changed. So we don't come into planning or even a kickoff with a set ratio or set percentage of time. I think we can go off of historically what has happened and maybe we initially staff based on that. But what Agile has really brought in is what is really needed needed, and then we're able to quickly assess and staff appropriately once we kind of get into the weeds of of actually refining and grooming to a very detailed level that work. And at the end of the day, we may have started out with a 40, a 20-40 ratio, but based off of the work that's actually needed, we may have come up with something very different. So I think that's what Agile's brought to the table, is not a kind of cookie cutter templatized way of doing projects, but really emphasizing what actually needs to happen, and then putting the solution in based on the people, processes, and tools that we have available to fill in those blanks.
Yeah. And Rachel just says she seconds Louis that this has been a very good presentation. Thanks, Rachel. And okay, I'll take this last question from Michael. He's been very enthusiastic, and there are so many questions from him. I'm sorry, Michael, I'm not going to be able to pick all of yours, but I'm going to take this one. He says, sometimes the customer drives the schedule and the company beckons on the customer, so bugs slip through. So how have you turned that around?
Yeah, I mean, if a customer dictates a schedule, I think it's beholden on the team to say, well, if we have to deliver in this date, then here's what we feel confident to deliver, and that's and that's to include the testing in there. So the customer there may be situations or conversations where what was expected and dictated by the customer to deliver everything, we will commit to delivering a certain percentage, hopefully all of it, or hopefully at least a high percentage of what the customer expects, but we should be ensuring the quality. And so, by really kind of using maybe that 8-10 split of the sprint to say, we're going to make sure that we don't allow things to be in a sprint and roll over continuously without a really good conversation. And in some cases, we may need to swarm as a team. I am always for swarming, doing, call them bug hunts, whatever you want to call them, but getting different sets of eyes on there. I'm a big proponent of preview releases or internal releases to internal employees of a company, a couple of weeks or more before we actually deliver to a customer. Because at some point, as you all know, once you get into testing over days and days and days, a new set of eyes brings something that you just would never be able to do. So I think, initiating and partnering with people that are outside of the project team to start looking at ways to test on behalf of the user, or in those cases, if you can, to bring in those customers, or either have, if they have their own testing team, to see if we can collaborate with them and get some of their test cases that they would be running. But I think, if a customer dictates a day or time or schedule, we have to be willing to have those conversations, but we should always be able to ensure the quality of the product that we are delivering to that customer, even if it means that they may not get everything that they expected to if they have that date.
All right, Melissa, I think for now we will have to give up on taking more questions in the interest of time. I'm sorry, guys. But the recording is available on the website, like www.softwaretestpro.com, and a lot of them wanted to directly reach you, Melissa. So I think on the registration site, you can find contact details of Melissa, and you can contact her directly with your questions. Or if you are truly unable to do that, maybe you can reach out to STP team, and we'll help you connect with Melissa.
Absolutely.
So, thank you so much, Melissa, for your time today. It was a very engaging session with loads of practical tips and information on getting more efficient. I'm sure our attendees found it very informative and useful too. So thanks again, and I hope to see you in Washington.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And if you haven't signed up for STPCon, please do. It's going to be a great conference.
Yeah, great. So everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining. And more importantly, seriously, thanks for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and for the whole group. Stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon. And if you haven't signed up yet for the upcoming webinar, You Bet Your Life Playing the Automation Tool Selection Game by Paul Grizappi, that's scheduled on 10th of May. I guess the link is already up for you to review and to register at softwaretestpro.com. So go ahead and register. Thanks everyone. Have a great day. See you all in Washington.
Bye-bye.